So things escalated very quickly. So we bought that property again, kind of as a proof of concept, kind of as a symbol, not really thinking that we would do much more other than hold that and let it do its thing while we continued to go live our lives. But 4 months later, the agent that sold us that first property called us, and he forwarded us an email that I'll never forget, and I reference it regularly. And it talks about these two houses that came across his desk. They were off market. They were both leased to operators for assisted living. So they had 5-year leases paying about 40% above the market rent. There was no vacancy. It was almost a triple net style lease. Like they covered all repairs up until about, the major CapEx items. So you're responsible for mechanicals and HVAC and roof and stuff like that. But other than that, it's about the best lease you could ever ask for a rental property. And there was two houses being sold together off market. So we had, no bidding war or anything. If we wanted them at the price that they were selling, then we had a shot at it. So we kind of, in our heads, we were brand new rental property owners. We were not sophisticated. Like I said, no mentors, no real base of knowledge to fall on, except of course my parents who had their experience. So we talked it through with them a ton, and we were not in a great financial position to be able to buy two more properties so shortly after buying the first one. But we ended up buying that. Long story short, we sold a bunch of stock. We pretty much drained our stock position down to nothing, which was a big risk. And we ended up doing a refinance on our primary home that we owned to buy those two properties because we recognized that the potential of those was so, 40% above market rent, no vacancy, incredible cash flow. It was just such a compelling long-term investment that we figured out a way to make it happen. But with that came this big identity shift. I think there's a lot of people that own maybe one or two rentals. They don't think of themselves necessarily as real estate investors. They do it because their financial advisor told them that it's smart to have real estate, or they haven't quite made the identity shift that, no, I am a real estate investor. I am a business owner. And I think when we bought those two as a package, and all of a sudden we went from 1 to 3 rentals in about a 6-month span, again, coming off of this big life change that I had earlier that year, that really lit a spark. And we started falling in love with the process of being real estate investors. Everything from like architecting the deal and understanding, how to set up all the different accounts, the tax planning. Like that's when I really fell down the rabbit hole and started understanding, like, if we continue to feed this and grow this to the best of our ability, the potential, not only the cash flow, but the wealth accumulation, the diversification and lack of reliance on W-2, lack of reliance on stock. It was just like, it all started flowing in my head so quickly. So to fast forward to your question about how did we end up with long distance? Well, one of, the things that we've learned many times over now, life is not, linear, and it's also not driven, in our case, by real estate investments. Like we were living the rest of our lives. So, during COVID, entertainment industry shut down overnight. It forced us to reevaluate everything. We had to find new employment. So we ended up moving back to Seattle, which is where I grew up. And we had 4 houses in Vegas. So we had to decide, do we keep these or do we sell them? The risk averse thing would be to sell them and just go buy a house in Seattle. But we said we worked so hard and so many things broke our way to get these 4 properties. It would feel foolish to just cut bait on that and leave. Like, let's figure it out. So during COVID, we moved there and we figured out how to self-manage from afar. It was far from perfect. We didn't have the best systems. We didn't have, we didn't even have a third-party property manager, but we figured it out and we strung together systems and leveraged connections that we had. So again, it was proof of concept. All of a sudden we were 1,000 miles away managing 4 properties. That gave us the courage. Fast forward just to round out the portfolio, we bought 2 properties while we were in Washington. And then we ended up doing a fully long distance. This is the only market that we had never lived in. We bought 3 houses in 2022 in an area called the Quad Cities in Iowa. And that was, again, like a brand new thing. We researched the market. We researched a ton of markets in the Midwest and the South. We picked one. We hired a team, agent, property manager, lender, all that stuff. So that was another proof of concept. I think all of these things were us kind of just trying to prove out different ideas to ourselves and see what works and build a long-term plan accordingly that fit into our lives instead of conforming to that plan, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think a business should always feed you or, provide you with what you want as opposed to you providing the business with what it wants, which I think 90% of people out there have it backwards. That's interesting because both my parents are from the Quad Cities, actually. So it's
Oh,
kind of
wow.
ironic that you bought there. They're from the Illinois side, but yeah, it's not a huge area. So it's funny that you landed there.
That's funny.
So it sounds like you got your first exposure to elderly care facilities through that second two properties that you purchased. And I want to come back to that. But first, I was curious because I think this question comes up a lot. You bought a lot of properties over a relatively short period of time. How did you finance all those? Because everyone's always like, "Oh, I'm going to run out of money," and I'd do that too if I was already rich. You see that in the comments all the time of videos or content. So what did that look like for you guys?
Yeah. So you're head on, or you hit the nail on the head. Everyone runs out of money at some point, whether it's on the first house or the 10th house. And for us, some of it I cannot take any credit for because we started buying at a very opportune time where the outside market was appreciating at rapid pace, especially in a city like Las Vegas. So we bought our first primary house in 2017. And that was, at the time in Vegas, we had a 4-bed, 2-bath house that we were able to buy. It was $250,000 in a neighborhood where that same house 3 years later was worth $330,000, right? So
Wow.
can't take any credit for that. We didn't do any real value add, but that was the one where I mentioned before, we were able to pull money out and use that to finance those two houses.
Mm-hmm.
We were dual income, no kids, in a low cost of living market. So even though we weren't making as much money as we'd like, we had a pretty decent control over our expenses and our ability to save. And we also skipped a big lavish wedding and ended up getting married in our backyard in Vegas, which this is one of the benefits of living in Vegas. We essentially made a decision in the moment that the expectations and the expense and all the stuff that goes into a big wedding, it just wasn't the right decision for where we were in our lives at that moment. And so we were able to save, a lot of money, nothing against big weddings, but by skipping that whole chapter, not only were we able to kind of start our married life earlier and start pursuing our goals, but we also saved all that money, which was a big part of what funded our first rental. So the first few were kind of leveraging different pieces of money from our personal financial life. But then from there, the market had appreciated quite a bit in Vegas by the time we moved. We moved back up to Washington. We struck 2 creative deals with my parents where the 2 properties that we found there, they were both ones that we bought as primary owner occupant. So we were able to buy them at lower down payments and really compelling interest rates. This was 2020. One of the interest rates was 2.7% and the other was 3.1%. Nice. And these were on pretty expensive properties, but we worked a deal out with them where the whole plan was always to move out of them and turn them into rentals. And then in that case, they put up a large part of the down payments, and then we split the cash flow once they turned into rentals. And then the kind of cash flow snowball from all of those combined was able to help roll and start buying some of those Iowa properties. So, there's no singular answer. It was kind of each transaction, each deal as it came across our plate, we figured out what tools we had available. We did a 401k loan for one of them. We did multiple refis. We lived in them before renting them. So I actually did a portfolio breakdown where I explain all this stuff. It's a little freebie I can maybe link to if anybody's interested, but it goes through each house and how we got it, what was going on in our life, and how that whole portfolio came to be. But to your point, their financing is one of the biggest barriers for most people. And it makes sense I think a lot of people assume that can't be solved. There's always a solution. It just depends. You gotta find the strategy that fits not only your financial goals, but also the types of strategies that you can learn and that you're willing to learn in order to implement it. So I don't know. We didn't do anything super fancy. It was just solving one problem at a time as it presented itself.
That's so key what you just said there, solving one problem at a time. I think the theme for me as you explain that is that you didn't know what the next step was, or maybe 3 steps into the future were. And I think all those people who, live in the comments and say, oh yeah, if I was a millionaire, I'd do this too, but I've never interviewed someone who starts off as like this super wealthy person who's like, I'm just going to get into real estate investing because it'll make me way more wealthy. Like, it's always people who start from scratch. They don't know what it's going to be like. Like for us, it was a very, very windy path, and we figured it out on each deal, different type of financing. And ultimately you figure out how to do the next deal then, and it starts to get easier. And now today we can do pretty, we have a pretty decent system that we can replicate, but in the beginning it doesn't always start off that way. But the key was just being willing to start. And I've never ran into someone who couldn't figure out the first deal. Like if it's truly a great deal and you have enough motivation, you can get a deal done. Whether you have a dollar to your name or not, like it's possible to figure out a way to structure a deal to get it done. And then you figure out the next one from there, and you just keep going. But I love that's such a great explanation, and you can tell that it's a real explanation, not just like here's what the book says to do, and I've never really actually done it. So I want to kind of transition from the 8 property portfolio that you built to what you're doing now with this new development, because this is a much larger deal than you've done in the past, different type of deal. And ironically, we were just talking about this. I had Brett, I think it's Chotskis. Chotkavis. I always struggle with his last name on the podcast, but he was on, I think about 7 or 8 episodes ago, if people want to go back and listen to that. But his whole premise is these elderly care mansions, he calls them, which is really cool. When I first heard it, I was like, these things don't sound like they go together, like a mansion and an elderly care facility. It feels like it evokes different types of emotions, I guess, or different thoughts of what these are, but they really do go well together. And after he explained it, I mean, it makes so much sense. I mean, the numbers were really compelling. So I'm curious, how you got linked up with him, because I know you're working with him to develop your own facility, and I want to talk through what that looks like and your projected numbers here and timeline and all that stuff. So how did this all start for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna hit this from a couple different angles. So first, from the rental portfolio, we're very proud of what we were able to do with those 8 properties. We had built, not only did we start overcoming all those mental barriers at the very beginning, and proving different things to ourselves throughout that journey, but we built it into something that was pretty sustainable too. It actually, at its peak, when we had all of our houses, fully stabilized, it was spitting off about $60,000 a year in net income. So that's after all expenses, maintenance, CapEx allocations, et cetera. So it's a pretty steady income stream. Now, I'm always reluctant to use cash flow for living expenses until and unless you absolutely have to. But nonetheless, it had put us in a pretty comfortable spot. But this is where I say life isn't linear, and like what's on the spreadsheets doesn't always work, because we also had 3 kids in 25 months. And if you're doing the math, we had twins in there, like Kirby mentioned before, but that changes everything, right? The math that we had used to try and calculate, the pace at which we would buy rental properties, our cash flow targets, all the financial side of the equation changed completely. Because, Kirby, you have 3 and the kids and another on the way. I'm sure, anyone who has kids probably recognizes like it changes not only your lifestyle, but your expense profile. And over an 18-year time horizon of raising kids, like you're going to have to be in a certain position. You're either with controlling your lifestyle and your expenses or increasing your income. Mm. So long way of saying that, that as proud as we are of the portfolio that we built, we had run out of our own money. We had run out of these kind of strategies to acquire more rentals. And all the while, the macro environment was changing. In 2022, we bought 3 houses in 2022, but the rates were going up and house prices were not correcting. So we kind of saw all these changes in our external life and to our personal balance sheet. And it made us realize that what we were doing at that time was not sustainable. And when I say that, I mean coming up with our own down payments, buying houses with 20 to 25% down payments, and that are making 200 to 300 a month in net cash flow. That just was not sustainable. So I just want to set that backdrop. Second thing is the second and third properties we ever bought, that 2-pack in Vegas, they were leased to assisted living operators. At the time, like I mentioned, we got an email from our agent. It fell into our lap is what it felt like. It felt like a fluke. It was an incredible arrangement. We loved it. It had performed really well over the preceding 5 years, but we didn't know how to duplicate that and build new relationships and find more of those. We heard an episode of a podcast, the Action Academy podcast, which I'm in that mastermind group. And there was a gentleman named Dr. Alex Schlow who came on, and he talked about this strategy, lease to operator assisted living, which is basically you can buy a rental property, and depending on the capacity and the strategy, you can lease it out to an operator, just like what we did in Vegas. You can find someone who wants to run an assisted living business, but they don't want to own the real estate, and they get on a long-term lease with you. And I said, wait a minute, that sounds exactly like what we've already done. And he was running a group that was teaching people how to do that strategy. It was a residential assisted living focused mastermind. So the second I heard that, this was 5 years after we bought the initial properties, my wheels got spinning so fast. I was like, oh my God. So we literally went and joined his group. And within that group, there were people that were operating their own assisted living. And that also just like kind of pressed our mind to the outer limits. I said, man, that sounds intense. That's a 24/7 business. It's a lot of responsibility. But at the same time, it's a great financial opportunity, and it's a huge impact to society at large. We started learning more about the problem of the senior care shortage for beds, assisted living beds that exist today. And then the projection, now that the baby boomers are getting into the senior age and retiring and aging faster than we have the capacity to deal with them, the more our eyes open to like, wow, this is actually, even in today's world where a lot of things are getting harder and affordability is getting out of control for rental properties, this is a big area of opportunity, both from a business and an impact standpoint. My wife had, her father was diagnosed with early onset dementia when she was a sophomore in college. And he was in a nursing home, a really poor quality nursing home for about 7 years before he passed away. And so when all this was coming together at the same time, she really also saw this model, and we found out about Brett and the memory care mansion model, which is this luxury building, that's centered around the highest quality of care, very personalized, very comfortable environment. And it was the antithesis of what her father went through in this big smelly nursing facility with nothing hanging on the walls, smelled horrible. The food was served on a cafeteria tray. Just a really sad experience for somebody to see their loved one in. So all these things, combined together kind of drew us towards that model with Brett. And we were in a group that was solely dedicated to assisted living. And over time, that really just drew us in. And we ended up hiring Brett to be our mentor and a strategic partner in this project and usher us end to end through the process of developing and then ultimately operating 2 assisted living homes in a suburb of Houston called Tomball, which is very close to where we live. So I'll pause there.